If you take a look at the world today, it can make you feel quite sick. Populism and plutocracy are on the rise everywhere, and the unequal distribution of rights and privileges is increasingly being defined once again by gender, skin color, and origin. Thanks to prevailing neoliberalism, we find ourselves in the absurd economic situation where the poor suffer the most from the excesses of capitalism, while socialism reigns for the rich. According to the motto, privatizing profit and socializing losses. Do you know who we need today to shake up this system? Incorruptible politicians with integrity and courage, someone with non-negotiable values and ideals, who puts the good of the community above his own. That's exactly the kind of person Samora Machel was. Samora Machel fought for the justice all his life. He battled against the Portuguese colonial power, which was not willing to let his country Mozambique go without bloodshed. He also fought against tribalism and everyday racism, which was not only visible in the unequal treatment between blacks and whites, but was deeply anchored in the thinking and mentality of the oppressed through centuries of brainwashing. He spent his life fighting, initially for Mozambique's freedom, then for the emancipation of his oppressed brothers and sisters in the apartheid states of Rhodesia and South Africa, and internationally against neocolonialism and the exploitation of Africa. His most famous saying, "A luta continua," which translates as "the struggle continues," shows quite clearly that the fight never ends.
A luta continua. A luta continua.
He would have continued to fight, fought until the end, but this freedom fighter was taken from life too early when his plane crashed over South Africa on the 19th October 1986. One can often read that it was a very mysterious tragedy and that there is no evidence for a culprit, but only because evidence was destroyed, the crash report contains flaws, and one still follows the outdated South African narrative today. Of course, it was not an accident, but we will get to that. Samora Machel is a symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice, freedom, and independence, as well as the resolute determination to enable the poor and oppressed to transform their lives. Until now, this great man has received far too little attention in Western discourse, yet he can serve as an inspiration to us all. That's why Your History Fox dedicates this video to Samora Machel and his struggle for free Southern Africa. So let's start at the beginning. Samora Moises Machel was born the son of a poor farmer's family on September 29, 1933, in the rural village of Chilembene in the southern part of Mozambique. The family knew the harsh realities of colonialism. The Portuguese had ruled Mozambique for about half a millennium, subjecting the indigenous people to exploitation, racial discrimination, and profound socio-economic disparities. Little Samora was a bright child who saw the inequality and could not ignore it. Perhaps this was a legacy of his grandfather Melangani, who rebelled against the Portuguese colonialists as a warrior alongside Gungunjana, the famous Lion of Gaza. Salazar's Portugal was itself the most underdeveloped European country and effectively bankrupt, so the administration in the Portuguese colonies looked accordingly. Unlike other European colonial powers, which sent middle or upper-class citizens to govern their colonies through newly established administration, Portugal sent its lowest-class citizens to the colonies, who then took jobs away from the natives. Portugal, unable to develop Mozambique, relied on quick money schemes like forcing all unemployed Africans into labor, basically reintroducing slavery and lending these forced laborers to other colonies, such as South Africa, to work in the mines there. Up to 50% of the male population of Mozambique was forced to slave away from home for months at a time. Samora's family was no exception. His older brother even died in the gold mine where he worked. But not only that, the family had to endure even more suffering when the Portuguese forced the local farmers to sell their harvest below value, so that the whites could then resell it at a high price. In addition, the family was forced to grow labor-intensive cotton for the Portuguese, leaving little time, money, or energy to grow enough food for themselves. At some point, the colonial regime even decided to relocate Portuguese farmers to Mozambique. The local farmers were completely dispossessed of their land and thus of their livelihood, and deported to infertile land. This experience of unequal treatment continued throughout Samora's life. Unlike other African freedom heroes such as Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, or Amilcar Cabral, Samora Machel did not study at a foreign university where they were exposed to the ideas of Marx or Lenin. Samora was a kind of socialist before he even knew what a socialist was. After completing his schooling, he worked as a hospital aide, a kind of nurse in Lourenço Marques, which is today Maputo. He stood out as a troublemaker, which made him some dangerous enemies. He said, The rich man's dog gets more in the way of vaccination, medicine, and medical care than do the workers upon whom the rich man's wealth is built. Samora, like many others, had had enough of racist oppression, and they were inspired by the other liberation movements taking place around them. Ghana, Congo, and Kenya were gaining independence, and in Algeria they were ready to go to war against the colonial power for freedom. After publicly protesting the unequal pay of black and white nurses, he was tipped off by a friendly observer that he had better to leave immediately, as he was being targeted by the ruthless Portuguese secret police PIDE. In a clandestine operation, Samora fled to neighboring Tanzania in 1962 to join other like-minded people who wanted to bring independence to Mozambique under the protection of Julius Nyerere. Having arrived in Dar es Salaam and becoming increasingly determined to get rid of the colonial powers that had a stranglehold on Africa, Samora now joined the newly founded Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, or FRELIMO. FRELIMO was a Mozambican anti-colonial group formed by the great Dr. Eduardo Mondlane. In Mondlane, Samora had found a mentor. Although both came from different worlds, Samora was a farmer's son from the countryside, filled with ambition and intelligence, but he could not break through the color bar because of his rebellious nature. Mondlane, on the other hand, made it to the US on a scholarship via Lisbon, where he became an anthropologist and taught as a professor of history and sociology at the University of New York. He was successful and had even received offers from the Salazar regime itself to work in the Portuguese administration. However, Mondlane dismissed these offers, foregoing his comfortable life to organize resistance and fight for the independence of his homeland. Samora could learn a lot from Mondlane, who saw potential in the young rebel. Thus, Machel was sent to Algeria, where he received military training. After Samora was back in Tanzania, FRELIMO under Mondlane decided to start a war of independence in Mozambique on September 25, 1964. At that time, Portugal was already fighting against the independence of its colonies in other African countries, including Angola and Guinea-Bissau. So now Mozambique as well. The unification of these countries against the common oppressor Portugal was extremely successful, because although the Portuguese were militarily superior, the independence fighters led a strategically clever guerrilla war, which Portugal could not cope with in the long run. Samora became a key commander and led the first guerrilla attack against the Portuguese in northern Mozambique. Samora also went into battle with his men in the further course of the war. His strategic and courageous leadership earned him the respect of his comrades and the wider African liberation movement. However, unlike some of his skeptics, it was clear to Machel that the guerrilla war was only the beginning. It was not just a matter of chasing the Portuguese from the continent. The shackles had to be broken in the minds of the people, which required a change in the entire society of Mozambique. He said, "All of the things we have done, the most important, the one that history will record as the principal contribution of our generation, is that we understood how to turn the armed struggle into a revolution, that we realized that it was essential to create a new mentality to build a new society." But before this could happen, Samora was struck by two terrible blows of fate. His mentor, Mondlane, was murdered in 1969 by a letter bomb from the Portuguese PIDE. Samora's famous saying, "A luta continua," originally came from Mondlane, and in memory of him it became the motto of his life and a never-ending struggle for freedom and peace. Samora now became commander-in-chief of FRELIMO, but he was soon struck by the next blow. He lost his great love, Josina, in 1971. The couple previously met in the FRELIMO training camp. In her short life, Josina was passionately committed to the resistance, the independence of her country, and above all, the emancipation of women. 2 years after their marriage, and at only 25 years old, Josina died, leaving Samora with a son, Samito. The fight for women's equality was something Samora took on throughout his life in her memory. Samora was understandably crushed, but the struggle for independence had to continue. Under Samora, the guerrillas beat back more and more of the Portuguese troops. On April 25, 1974, the inevitable happened. The Portuguese officers, tired of fighting 3 unwinnable wars in Africa, overthrew the government in Lisbon. The Carnation Revolution took place. The overthrow was bloodless, as no one took to the streets to defend the regime. But even though the fascist and rotten Estado Novo regime had been toppled, this did not mean peace for the colonies in Africa. Samora kept a cool head, and he knew that there was no such thing as democratic colonialism. No Mozambican would tolerate Portuguese rule just because there was a new government. General Antonio de Spinola took the wheel for Portugal. Even though he was the first post-coup president, he could not be trusted, because he was said to have had a hand in the assassination of of independence fighter Amilcar Cabral a few months earlier. And Spinola had no intention of letting the valuable colonies go. Instead, he dreamt of a Lusophone commonwealth, like the British one. He wanted to hold a referendum in Mozambique, to which Samora Machel only scoffed, "You don't ask a slave if he wants to be free, particularly when he is already in revolt, and much less if you happen to be a slave owner." Samora was still not at the end. A luta continua. The struggle still continued. He did not agree to the Portuguese request for a ceasefire. As long as there was no definitive independence for Mozambique, the struggle would continue. On June 25, 1974, Mozambique was finally able to declare independence after almost 470 years of foreign rule and 11 years of war. The Frelimo now established a new constitution. Mozambique became a one-party state under Frelimo with a socialist agenda. Machel became independent Mozambique's first president and was affectionately referred to as President Samora. Immediately after taking office, President Samora set himself the task of distributing wealth fairly. The state, and not profit-oriented exploitative companies, was to provide for the population. And so the land stolen by the Portuguese was nationalized. How just and full of integrity Machel was is also shown by the fact that he did not give back to his family the land that was taken away from them by the Portuguese in the past. Instead, he said, the Frelimo did not fight for the president's father to get land, but for the nation to get food. All health and education institutions were nationalized. The Catholic Church in particular lost its monopoly on private schools and clinics, and with it, its privileges. In addition, the renting of houses was nationalized. Machel asked, landlords, what do we want landlords in our country for? Another reason why we would need a Machel today. In fact, it was not forbidden to own houses. You were just not allowed to rent them. This changed the urban landscape in Mozambique. The black population was now able to return to the cities because the Portuguese landlords had to give up their apartments. Mozambique experienced a rapid upswing due to Machel's quick implementation of the reforms, but the struggle was not over here either. At the time of his presidency, the world was divided. The Cold War was on, with the major opposing poles, capitalist America on the one side and the communist USSR on the other, recruiting allies around the world, sometimes by force. Machel was a socialist, but not because the Soviets talked him into it. No, he was a socialist indeed, and even contradicted the Soviets' Marxist-Leninist doctrine, which made him an uncontrollable but nonetheless valuable partner for them. For the US, Machel represented a threat to American interests in Africa, and especially for the white minority settler governments ruling Rhodesia and South Africa's apartheid regime. Samora Machel represented the embodiment of everything they hated and sought to suppress. A powerful, incorruptible black man committed to building a non-racialist socialist society. Samora Machel's struggle did not stop at the Mozambique border, and so he opposed Ian Smith's government in Rhodesia with economic sanctions backed up by the UN. He closed the borders to Mozambique and thus to the economically crucial port. He also supported the freedom fighters around Robert Mugabe by training them in Mozambique for the armed struggle. With Machel's support, the struggle for independence in Rhodesia, which was to be called Zimbabwe from 1980, was won. Machel also supported the African National Congress in South Africa in their fight against the apartheid regime. As you can imagine, Samora did not only make friends with that. The apartheid regime soon counterattacked, creating a rebel army from Rhodesia called Renamo to destabilize Mozambique and led it into a civil war. The Renamo forces, supported by Rhodesia and South Africa, killed civilians, destroyed schools and hospitals, sabotaged and blew up railroad tracks and dams. All the things Machel and Frelimo did for the people were cowardly destroyed. Machel did not let himself to be defeated though. He declared in Maputo, "They want to come here and commit murder. So we say, let them come. Let all the racists come. Let the South Africans come, but let them be clear that the war will end in Pretoria." But Machel soon had no choice but to sign a non-aggression pact, the so-called Nkomati Accord, with South Africa's president P.W. Botha. The content was simple. South Africa would drop its support for Renamo in exchange for Mozambique dropping support for the anti-apartheid movement ANC. Machel held up his end of the deal, but South Africa did not. In fact, even before the signing, South Africa ensured that heavy military equipment was delivered to Renamo at their new base in Malawi. This was possible because Malawi was ruled by dictator and collaborator Hastings Banda. Banda was one of the few African rulers who supported the apartheid regime in South Africa, which is why many considered him a traitor. Samora threatened Banda that if he continued to support Renamo and the war against Mozambique, Mozambique would close its border to Malawi, which would result in a landlock of Malawi, meaning no access to the Indian Ocean, a threat that had an impact. On the 19th October 1986, Machel met in Zambia with the other frontline states. Those were states calling for an end to the apartheid regime in South Africa. The aim was to put pressure on both Banda and the Zairian dictator Mobutu so that they would not continue to support South Africa's attempts to destabilize the country. This might have been the moment when South Africa decided to get rid of Samora Machel for good. That same day, Samora Machel boarded his plane, a Soviet Tupolev 134, to return to Maputo, but he was never to arrive there. The plane crashed in South Africa, killing 34 of the 42 occupants, including Samora Machel. The South African government initiated the investigation of the crash, attributing it to weather conditions, the age of the Soviet plane, or potentially drunken Soviet flight attendants. In fact, the investigation was headed by a certain Judge Cecil Marco, who concluded pilot error. He disregarded the theory that the plane was blown off course by a jamming signal. One should be very skeptical about any investigation led by Marco. In 1961, when the plane of Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations, crashed mysteriously, he led the investigation and came to the same conclusion: pilot error. Stuff like this just happens. It is possible that the infamous super spy Craig Williamson had a hand in this too. He had already killed the anti-apartheid activists Ruth First and Dulcie September, and perhaps even Olof Palme, the Swedish prime minister who fought against the apartheid regime and whose murder is still unsolved. In fact, South Africa's P.W. Botha had previously met with Williamson to plan Machel's overthrow. In the end, it was apparently decided to get rid of him entirely. Samora Machel died at the age of 53, now reunited with his old mentor Eduardo Mondlane and his dear Josina. He left behind several children, including one with his wife Graça, whom he married after independence. In his memory, Graça remained committed to the struggle against apartheid and later married Nelson Mandela, making her the only first lady of two countries in the world. President Samora led Mozambique for 11 years. His death marked a significant loss for Mozambique and Africa. His journey from humble beginnings to becoming a national hero is a testament to the transformative power of perseverance, courage, and commitment to social justice. He was a proud African who believed in the strength that lies in unity. He did not just fight for himself, but for Mozambique, for Zimbabwe, the anti-apartheid movements, and for all the oppressed people in Africa and the world. Viva Samora Machel, viva! May the struggle for which he gave his life continue. A luta continua. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please like this video and subscribe to my channel.